For tens of thousands of years, for most of human life on this planet, no such thing as civilization existed. History, though, is the story of civilized mankind. Civilizations are the largest units into which we can break up and organize that story. When civilizations appeared, they made possible a new richness of human life, a new complexity. And so, patterns of human life in different parts of the world became more and more unlike one another. Each civilization had also its own way of seeing the world, its own religions and myths, its own images of gods and of men. These patterns of life long stayed very distinct, self-sufficient even when they were neighbors. Of course, individuals like traders and warriors could penetrate the invisible membranes which surrounded them. But they inhabited different cultural zones, where men wore clothes, built buildings, and even thought in ways quite unlike men elsewhere. It took thousands of years for the barriers to begin to crumble. But then one civilization began to change the world as it had never been changed before. And as it did so, the outlines of a shared world civilization began to appear. Western civilization changed the world. It created the global civilization which we take for granted, the only world civilization there has ever been. Sometimes the results have been superficial. Sometimes they've gone deep. But everywhere, the dangerous gifts of the West are undermining patterns of life left undisturbed for centuries. According to your point of view, you can call that inspiration and education, or infection, corrosion, corruption. You can deplore the breaking of ties with the past, or applaud a liberation from them. But somehow, the result is a triumph over minds such as has never been achieved before. Flawed, ambiguous, paradoxical it may be, but it is nonetheless a historical triumph for Western civilization. I want to explore, in 13 films, how that civilization came into being. How it grew from its roots in the ancient world of Greece and Rome. How one day it came to challenge and then transform the world. When I was a boy, I once read something about the ancient Romans which made a tremendous impression upon me. Here in Rome, they used to hold ceremonies which they called triumphs. We get our word from that, but their triumph was something much more specific than what we think of. For them, a triumph was a celebration held when a victorious general came back from the wars. On his return from his campaign, they would put him in a chariot, put a wreath of victory on his brows, and then draw him through the streets in honor to the capital, where the Senate would receive him. Trumpets would play and the crowds would cheer, and his captives would be in chains before him, and it must have been an absolutely splendid day for him. But the Romans were a cautious and a superstitious people, and to avert the malice of the gods and to remind their general just who he was, they put somebody else in the chariot too, a slave. And from time to time, the slave would lean forward and say to the general, "Remember, remember, thou too art human." Perhaps that's why, as a historian, I'm not much impressed by the presentation of the past as mere pageant, as the story of the deeds of supposed great men or the rise of arrogant and complacent empires. And there have been plenty of those. For me, history is quite simply the best route towards the understanding of our present. So complex and ambiguous and ironical a fact as the impact of the West upon the rest of the world seems to me only to be explicable in terms of history. We have to uncover its roots, what made it what it was, how it came to be. After all, there wasn't always a Western civilization. There wasn't even always a Europe to cradle it. To explain those things, we have to go back a long time. Few television programs don't give a great deal of time for that. We can only give a little of the history of the West, and that in not much detail. But I can offer one man's interpretation, one man's view from a particular society at a particular moment in time, and it's a view which I think ought to be and can be argued for. It's a view of a very remarkable phenomenon, the way in which one civilization among many came to sway the destinies of the whole world. I'd like to start in Thailand. It's a country with a centuries-old and very proud culture. Traditionally, the Thais are Buddhists. Like most Asian peoples, they now use the Western calendar. But that doesn't stop them, each April, celebrating their own astrological new year in traditional fashion. At such moments, Thais show their conservatism, that they like to keep old ways going. Old ways that are more precious because they're threatened. That makes it easy to fall into the trap set by the old cliches about the unchanging Orient. Thailand, or as it used to be called Siam, is unique among the nations of Asia, indeed almost unique in the entire world, in that Western powers never ruled it as a colony and never occupied or invaded its home territories. China, India, even Japan were not so spared. And it wasn't because Siam was inaccessible, far from it. Siam had relations, commercial, religious, diplomatic, with Europe as long ago as the 17th century. And in the 19th century, she had to face the same threats as other parts of Asia. On the one side of her, the British nibbled away at fringe territories, on the other side, the French. In the end, true, it suited those two powers to leave her as an independent buffer state between British Burma and French Indochina, but Siam had in the end also to sign its own unequal treaties with the Western powers. Yet somehow she remained remarkably herself. Perhaps that's suggested by a place like this, the Temple of the Emerald Buddha in Bangkok, really the chapel royal of the Grand Palace of the Kings of Siam. Does even so striking an individual place as this, though, really mean that Siam somehow escaped the force of westernization? Of course it hasn't. Thailand has had to yield to the new uniformities that are sweeping through the world. Technology and its costs in pollution and strain is only a part of the story. For all that remains of the old Bangkok, the new shows a scale and style of life increasingly shaped by the West, and it seems inescapable. Thailand is now plugged into a worldwide system of communications. But television suggests new, standardized ways of behaving. It disrupts settled ways and desires, and spreads the desires and ways of the West. Take uniforms. It isn't just the Western style of those worn by the girls in the Thai Navy which is so striking. It's the acceptance of the Western notion of having women in the Navy at all. Something very deep and complicated is at work, involving many forces, all pointing in the same direction, to the erosion of a familiar and traditional past. China experienced the Western impact in a way very different from Thailand. True, for all the damage done to her by Western nations, she was never ruled by them. But they occupied bits of her territory, and they bullied her rulers. China is a huge country of many climates, languages, and dialects, but for 2,000 years she was ruled as a unity. China was the seat of a unified empire, an empire which was also a great civilization. That civilization was one of the most splendid that have ever existed. Its cultural and scientific achievements were formidable. No wonder China's rulers saw the empire as the center of the world. Little of that civilization, of course, ever reached down to the peasant, whose labor ultimately paid for it. For her whole history, China has had a huge population living off agriculture. At a casual glance today, life in the Chinese countryside still seems to have been not much affected by the comings and goings of regimes and ideologies. Yet the lives of the peasants have, in fact, been transformed. Even if horse traders still bargain as they have done for centuries, they do so in a revolutionized social context. Chinese civilization now has a new look. "35 years ago, a People's Democratic Republic was set up in China. And now, between a fifth and a quarter of mankind is ruled by men who claim to uphold a Western ideology, Marxist communism. Whatever tradition still counts for, and it counts for much, 1,000 million Chinese are ruled in the name of a German intellectual of the Romantic era, born in the Rhineland, a man who never saw Asia in his life and showed contempt for it in almost every reference to it in his books. It's interesting to see that in a reading room of the University of Peking, there was little on the shelves except the works of the master, Karl Marx, and his disciples, Lenin, Stalin, Mao. Even if interpreted in a special and Chinese way, a Western ideology appears to have triumphed. A Western language is the most widely taught foreign language too, and not just in the university.
Such a bearded thing.
Literally millions of Chinese learn English by radio and television. English has become the second language of the world.
Insolent is probably the best translation. The word is that you have to think about the impact of the sentence. It has to be funny. It has to be funny.
Communism has brought the Chinese enormous benefits, whatever the cost. Perhaps for the first time in China's history, they are neither hungry nor in rags. And outside the university, other influences from the West are at work upon old China. Many Chinese can now glimpse something of the abundance technology holds out, in whatever political package it comes. It's not just a question of style. Fashion and consumer goods hold out promises of a freer, more informal, more individual life. There's a lot to remind one of the past in China, but sometimes one finds it right alongside something totally at variance with it, juxtaposed violently, like this hotel. What does building a hotel like this in China mean? Clearly, it's a bid for trade, for tourism, for the hard currency that goes with it. And so you give them a little oriental atmosphere, but you make sure the rooms are air-conditioned, that there are beauty salons and Western food in the restaurants. But in fact, that's not the end of the story. You're also showing your own people alternatives. Alternative values, alternative ways of doing things. Now, China accepted one challenge from the West in the past already, Marxism, though it took it in a very Sinicized form. But this challenge is different. It's one of lifestyles, of assumptions about the individual and his goals and their fulfillment, of what we might call consumerism. How will that affect China? What will that do to the traditional readiness of China to impose on the individual a social discipline which in the West would be thought intolerable? China has long been faced with a cultural choice between her traditions and those of the West. And nowadays, though a few years ago the Cultural Revolution was meant to eradicate Western influence, you can go to the Peking Opera and hear Puccini's Madame Butterfly. There are plenty of ironies in that. Japan, China's junior neighbor, was for centuries a secret kingdom locked away from the world, even from the inquisitive Europeans who'd begun to roam the globe in the 15th century. But she too had in the end come to terms with the predatory power of the West, and she found a specifically Japanese way of doing so. 1,000 years or so ago, Japan took the main elements of her culture from China. From China came Confucianism, Buddhism, the foundations of Japanese calligraphy, many of her technological skills. But China never ruled Japan politically, nor, except briefly, has anyone else ever done so. The Japanese had the advantages and outlook of an island people. Myths and values quite alien to those of Western civilization are still operating in Japan. The Japanese long saw themselves as self-sufficient, a big family, ruled by its head, the emperor who was a descendant of the sun god. To the shrine of the great national benefactor, the Meiji emperor whose spirit still watches over the national family, still come all ages and classes. Young executives still have their children blessed there, as a European or American might have his children christened in a historic church. To visit the shrine a few hundred yards from the bustle of commercial Tokyo is to be reminded that it was in order to keep their own ways that the Japanese selected what they wanted from the West. In the 16th century, the Portuguese had made an appearance. But when their zeal for converting the Japanese to Christianity became too successful, they were thrown out. For about 250 years, Japanese culture and society was preserved apparently unchanged. The price was isolation, a cultural quarantine. During those 2.5 centuries, a few Dutch were the only Europeans officially allowed to land in Japan. Even they were confined to a tiny island in the harbor of Nagasaki, Deshima. The Japanese observed the mysterious Occidentals and their curious ways and wanted to know more about them. Some Japanese learnt Dutch. They copied and translated Dutch books, technical studies of navigation or surgery, for instance. They were the seedbed of the idea that Japan might have to learn from Western nations. Deshima is now swallowed by the modern city built after the last war, when the old Nagasaki was wiped out by the West. In 1853, a startling event took place. Into Edo Bay, the site of modern Tokyo, sailed 4 black ships. They belonged to the United States Navy and were commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry, who brought a letter from his president demanding that his countrymen be allowed to trade with Japan. The next year he came back with more ships, and he got his answer, a treaty opening 2 ports to the Americans. Other treaties with the European nations quickly followed. They were unequal treaties in that Japan rulers signed them, knowing they could not resist the firepower of the Western warships. Taking up their new opportunities, European and American merchants began to come to Japan in the 1860s and 1870s. Some of them settled down there, built houses for themselves in a vaguely colonial style, like these in Nagasaki. They lived very pleasant lives. A lot of the Japanese resented the presence of so many Western Europeans and Americans. After all, they were, in the literal sense, privileged. They were privileged at law. They were under the jurisdiction of their own consuls, not of Japanese courts of law. That was one of the things stipulated in the unequal treaties that the Japanese had to sign with the Western powers at the end of the 1850s. Like the restrictions on Japanese tariff policy, it was an infringement of their independence, of their government of their own territories. Above all, it was a badge of inferiority, and it rankled. One popular and conservative slogan was, "Expel the barbarians," but that didn't seem very plausible after Commodore Perry's visit. By then, too, many of Japan's rulers had come to the conclusion that Japan ought at least to adopt some Western ways to benefit herself. So a new slogan began to be heard: Japanese spirit, Western techniques. To keep her freedom, Japan made a conscious decision to modernize. In 1867, a new, vigorous young emperor came to the throne. With the support of a group of conservative elder statesmen, the capital was moved to Tokyo, and he proclaimed his intention to rule on modern lines. This was the Meiji Restoration. In the next 20 years, Japan became, apparently, a constitutional state on the Western model, with a free press, a mass education system, and a conscript army. The decision to modernize was taken, of course, by very few, very far-sighted Japanese, but it had widespread popular support. There were many people who saw in it a way to the recovery of national power and dignity for their nation. The years after Perry's arrival had been humiliating ones for the Japanese, but there was one road down which they knew they could be sure of respect in Western eyes: success in war, and they took it. In 1894, the Japanese astounded the world. They made a sudden attack on China, shattered that country's navy, and imposed on it a humiliating peace treaty. But then, in a fresh insult, the French, Germans, and Russians ganged up on them and brought pressure to bear on Japan to give up some of her conquests. Still, they went on building up their strength, with Western help, too. The British, for instance, did an enormous amount to shape the Imperial Japanese Navy. For years, British officers trained Japanese youths in gunnery and tactics and signaling, as well as in the traditions of the Royal Navy and memories of Nelson. And the British built ships for the Japanese, too. This battleship, for example, built at Barrow-on-Furness in 1901, and 4 years later, in action as the flagship of Japan's greatest naval hero, Admiral Togo, who'd been a cadet on the British training ship Worcester. That was in the war where modernization finally paid off for Japan, the war which Japan launched against Russia in 1904. The war was just modern enough to have left its mark on the movie archives. It was a hard fight. Japan only just won, but victory opened the way to world power for her. That power was her reward for embarking upon westernization for herself without waiting to have it thrust upon her. Unhappily, it was to delude some of Japan's leaders into militarist adventure, and ultimately to shattering defeat at the hands of Western powers.
I now invite the representatives of the Emperor to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Yet 1945, too, was not the end of the story. Now, more than a century after the Meiji Revolution, Japan is an industrial superpower. Her economic success appears so great that in peace, if not in war, she has been feared as a power that really might dominate the world. Superficially, there is much to suggest that Japan has turned herself into a Western nation. But of course she hasn't. Great historic peoples cannot shed their pasts like a snake's skin. But Japan has nonetheless been marked indelibly by the cultural impact of the West. Cultural triumph is very hard to define. It's certainly much more difficult to pin down than political or economic conquest. Take, for instance, this pot. It was made by someone who many would say was probably the greatest English potter of this century, Bernard Leach. But it was Japan that made Leach a potter. He went there, studied there for many years with a great master, and what he learnt and what he experienced always marked his work thereafter. And so even in the 1960s, he could produce something like this, a mixture, curiously, of East and West, very close, very intimate, and very beautiful. Of course, the waves of artistic influence have always washed back and forth between cultures. There are plenty of marks of past enthusiasms in our own Western style to show that. Chinoiserie in the 18th century, the cult of the Japanese print, which so struck 19th century painters, those African masks that fascinated the Cubists at the beginning of this century, they all show it. And often they deeply affected the lives of individuals, as indeed a case like Leach's shows. And then there were other forces too. Religious currents from the Far East, for example. Buddhism, mysticism, which often changed the lives of many people and not just writers and intellectuals. And yet, when one thinks about it, such things always seem to be exceptional, special, perhaps even rather marginal, and not a part of the great currents which are actually changing the shapes of whole societies and cultures. Japan was able to choose what she wanted from the West. Other countries have had change thrust upon them by the West. The idea that the triumph of the West was a triumph of imperialism dies hard. The greatest single example of Western imperial rule was India. The Indian Republic now celebrates its independence each year, but is still deeply marked by legacies from the Raj, the unique British form in which the dangerous gifts of the West came to India. For 250 years, Western influence in India overwhelmingly meant British influence, the impact of the British Raj, the Indian Empire. The Republic is a constitutional state, which has, on the whole, stuck to its fundamental legal and parliamentary principles. Its constitution is rooted in European liberal ideology. And yet it's still hard to pin down what the legacy of the Raj now means. People have been racing horses for time immemorial. The ancient Greeks did it, and no doubt the Mughals did it too. But there's no doubt also that the British left the stamp of their particular version of horse racing right round the world. This is the Royal Calcutta Turf Club, the premier and most senior of all the racing clubs of the Far East. One time it regulated racing on 160 courses from Mandalay to Peshawar. But that was before the Great War. It was then something like the Jockey Club of Great Britain. And another thing, if you look round, look at the clothes. The ladies are wearing saris, beautiful and elegant garment. But most of the men present are wearing Western dress. You wouldn't have to go far outside the Turf Club to see more Western dress on Indians. For many Indians, though, dress is still a marker of community and locality. A marker of that diversity which is one reason why it's so difficult to decide what Westernization, a standardizing force, actually meant. Even among Christian Indians, advertisements in the press for brides and bridegrooms often specify community and colour of skin as clearly as they specify degrees and diplomas. Hindus would specify caste, yet thousands of Indian women attend universities and enter the professions, and that is an enormous revolution. The interplay of civilizations is very complex, not easily pinned down.
If there was a lady and you wanted to marry her and you had no money, would you like to have money only to show off?
Imitations of British public schools still give young upper-class Indians an English curriculum, and not just Shakespeare, but dress and discipline too. And it gives them an introduction to Western science. And if you look at the longer term, history has for decades pointed the direction in which the tide is moving. Since the end of the last century, India has been on the road to industrialization. Western technology first appeared in the textile factories. From them, it spread to other industries. It was accelerated by the demands of 2 world wars, by Indian entrepreneurs, and by the deliberate adoption of a development program after independence. And now, India is a steel exporter. And a new wave of technological change is beginning to roll. In it lies the promise of further change too, not just material, but mental. Western technology offers new aspirations, a new sense of the possible. The growth of the Indian scientific community which sustains it has implications which go beyond technology. India's Nobel Prize winners, her tracking stations and laboratories, imply a way of looking at the world, at the cosmos, which is totally at variance with that of India's hundreds of millions whose lives are still dominated by tradition and routine. Changes like that are at work all over India. They have very little to do with direct imperialism, but their consequences can be just as ambiguous and just as dangerous. Electricity reduces drudgery. Yet such clear advantages raise hopes, and some hopes are clearly unsatisfiable in the short run, and perhaps even in the long. The generation of new expectations may turn out to be a terrible legacy, and the most disruptive of all the dangerous gifts of Western civilization. The psychological effects of those hopes and expectations have to be added to all the other forces flowing from the West which have played upon India. Those forces are great breakers down of established ways, great stirrers up of society, and not just here in India. All around the world now, in developing nations, men are trying to enlist them in the search for wealth. And perhaps they're right to do so. But they will find that technology and industrialization bring other things with them too. As they did in the West, they will overturn established patterns of work. They will change the role of women in society. They will standardize the material basis of life. They will lead to people being paid in cash and not in other ways. Here in India, it may be that they will open the way to becoming one nation for the first time in its long history. But there will be a price to be paid. And more Indians seem to be willing to pay the price. Even if they're still only a minority among the thousands of millions of mankind, millions of people have now seen that improvement is possible, that the pursuit of happiness is a legitimate goal, that things do not have to be always as they are. And some of them have gone further still. They may not know it consciously, but they've got hold of another Western idea, perhaps the most explosive of all. The notion that history is going somewhere, that it is progressive, or more revolutionary still, that it ought to be, that things should be changed. So how much of the impact of the West in India is due to British imperialism? How much is the dominance of the West today due to firepower, the military might of the United States, who many see as the successors to the British imperialists of the last century? At first sight, imperialism does indeed seem to explain a great deal. It couldn't be left out of any historical assessment of Western civilization. For a long time, after all, there were Europeans conquering and then ruling parts of the world, and they sometimes imposed their will even outside those areas. And yet, people have taken up imperialism as an explanation for more dubious reasons. In some parts of the world, it's a convenient scapegoat, a blanket excuse for all sorts of local failures and shortcomings. And there are people in the West who are drawn to the idea because they feel somewhat guilt-ridden about what their ancestors and forerunners did centuries ago. The core of truth in the idea was that indeed Europeans were able to use their superior weaponry and other material advantages to coerce other people and get their own way. But that really doesn't explain quite enough. The age of imperialism, after all, was pretty brief in the whole history of Western civilization. At its peak, its climax lasted perhaps 50 years, the half century or so before 1914, no more. And now European nations rule about as much of the world only as they ruled 500 years ago. The empires have crumbled, with the exception of the Russian, and even the Russians and their co-inheritors of world power, the Americans, have found that there are limits to their great might, have found those limits in Vietnam, Central America, Afghanistan, the Middle East. Sheer firepower, sheer strength, was never the whole story, either in the age of imperialism or after. Something much more aggressive than Western imperialism is at work in the world today. Western economics, Western culture, Western science, Western technology have yet to make their full impact on people like these stevedores in Mombasa. But they surely will. All over the world, ideas of history and human destiny which animated old cultures are now threatened with a breakdown. In so many ways, the West is eating away the culture that binds people to their past. It destroys the universe of stable expectations, and no force is doing that more surely than capitalism. For over a century, capitalism has shown a sustained power to create wealth on a colossal, unprecedented scale. The world impact of the Western economies, from the days of the first Portuguese who raided West Africa for gold and slaves to the huge multinational corporations of today, has been irresistible. The wealth that capitalism generated can be seen all over the world. Critics can point to spectres at the Western feast. Slums and luxury skyscrapers sprawling side by side in the great cities of the Third World. But how much is this a matter simply of scale? Often, all that has happened is that a new visibility has been given to social fissures and injustices which were always there in the past. Western societies have been the only ones ever to generate the idea, because they generated the possibility, that poverty might be abolished. And another irony, their own very abundance has helped to increase the numbers in the global slums by making survival easier. And if the West has intensified the misery of the deprived by holding out dreams of a better material life, it's also offered them consolations. It has offered a faith to sustain them in tribulation or an opiate to kill their pain. It depends on your point of view. All great civilizations have had religion at their heart, and Christianity is inseparable from Western history. And through the West, it changed the world. A religious message which had once been confined to a tiny, despised Jewish sect swept across continents and peoples, changing their historical destinies. Why should that have been so? Christianity, unlike most religions, was an active, striving creed. As well as devotion and prayer, it sought to build a new kind of world. It urged believers in Christ to remake without compromise the old, corrupt world into a new one. History, like the chosen people of the Old Testament, was going somewhere. And so wherever Christianity has gone, it has challenged, confused, destroyed other beliefs. Christianity has spread round the world the idea that life here and now should be lived and directed by otherworldly values. Its goals lay not only in the next world, but in this one. Those values, those goals, still have their resonance in a non-religious age. I believe that most of the dynamic values, shaping myths and master principles at work changing the world today can be shown to derive from the West. And nowhere is that more obvious than here in New York at the United Nations. At the United Nations, the delegates deal in such currencies as democracy, nationalism, socialism, Marxism, human rights, and much else from the kit bag of Western reforming radical thought.
So I've now brought you into the General Assembly Hall, which is the largest room here on the complex, where all 158 are represented. Two liberation organizations are represented here, the PLO and also SWAPO. Otherwise, in the General Assembly...
Those values have passed almost unnoticed into a political cant now taken for granted the whole world round.
The show of force and muscle flexing have become a matter of routine in imperialist conduct these days. Those policies of the United States administration.
So, when non-Western nations denounce the Americans or Russians in the General Assembly or in the Security Council, they do so in terms of Western politics.
Comrade President, the Mongolian People's Republic fully shares the alarm and concern voiced by the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya at the further exacerbation of the situation.
The new political world is still in the making. Obviously, the age when a few European nations, together with perhaps the United States and the Soviet Union, could run the affairs of the world are over. And the empires have gone too. There are now about 160 member states in the United Nations. The proliferation of new countries since 1945 has been very fast, and some people have seen that as producing a greater instability in world affairs, a greater danger, a danger of conflict, of war, and perhaps in the background of every war now there's always the feeling that there looms a potential nuclear cloud. Add to that the enormous damage done to economic confidence in the West by the energy crisis of the 1970s, and the much longer and slower loss of belief in the old cultural values, and it's easy enough to understand why some people should feel that this once supremely effective civilization may now perhaps at last have shot its bolt. Its power may be just a residue, and perhaps there is even worse decline in store. Ironically, all that has happened just at a moment when Western culture is still showing its old power to corrode and destabilize other cultures and civilizations as strongly as ever. In the past, whole civilizations have gone down before it, and it still seems to be at work today. The success of Western cultural influence is just what has provoked reaction, a fighting back. Yet though a deep cultural rejection of the West seems to be underway in some parts of the world, only one anti-Western reaction seems to have drawn successfully on non-Western sources. That is Islam. Islam once produced a brilliant civilization whose arts and sciences outshone those of Europe. In the Middle Ages, Islam tested, penetrated, and shaped Christendom. It could mobilize huge forces of emotion and will. Orthodox Islamic law taught that there would always be a state of war between Islam and the house of war, the non-Muslim world. The most striking expression of that doctrine in recent years has been in Iran. The Imams draw on Islam to reinforce a conservative response to the cultural threat they see to their tradition, quite rightly, in every side of westernization. The Americans now serve as the latest of a long line of Islamic demons, the objects of a hate tapped for centuries by Muslim fundamentalists. But if it is a question of Western political power, more damage has probably been done to it by Western ideas turned against it than by those of other civilizations. For in the end, the triumph of the West is not political or economic. It is cultural. Here in Southampton, I live in a city with a very long history. It was a medieval seaport, and a great one long before the transatlantic liners came here. And from seaports like this, scores of them all over the Western world, they're set out for centuries, ships which went round the globe. East Indiamen from London to Canton and Calcutta, Dutchmen from Amsterdam to Nagasaki and Malacca, the Portuguese sailing from Lisbon to East Africa and the Persian Gulf, and later, New Englanders from Massachusetts Bay going to Shanghai and the China trade. And during all those centuries, so far as I know, not one Arab dhow or Chinese junk ever came back here or to any of those Western ports. Why? I think historians should think about such things. Of course, it's their professional duty to think about the past, not just to give people pictures of it. They'll have those pictures anyway. But in order to give them a picture which is critical, which is pondered. And that's why we made this series of films, and why in them we considered so many nations, peoples, historical topics of all kinds. Ancient Greece and Rome, medieval Europe and Islam, Russia, that strange enigma. We have to penetrate and break through the stereotypes of the Cold War in order to understand how she too, at a very deep level, is really a part of the West. The impact of the West on India, on China, and many, many other matters. In considering them, perhaps there's just a chance we might get a little nearer to a reasoned, conscious, articulate reading of the past, one that would enable us to grapple a little better with the unexamined assumptions, the prejudices, the fears, the arrogance, and the sheer stark irrationality with which otherwise history is always threatening to master us. If, in fact, we don't understand the difference that Western civilization has made to the world, for good or ill, better or worse, then we shall be just a little more unable to grapple with our own times. They'll become just a bit more intractable, a bit more menacing. We shan't understand them properly. I think we have to seek to achieve a sense of the sheer weight of the past. And for us, that past is the past of a world which has been radically reshaped by the West.